right, so we are going to get started. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I am Melissa Aikens. I'm at the University of New Hampshire, where I'm a discipline-based education researcher. Though I didn't get my start in education. I actually got my PhD studying plant ecology and evolutionary biology. I love ecology and evolutionary biology, but I also love teaching. And so when I graduated from getting my PhD, I found this really unique opportunity to do research in education. It was kind of an emerging field in biology at the time. And I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. I will try it. And it turned out I really liked it. And it is a lot harder than studying plants, I will say. Humans are way less predictable than plants, which I did not understand when I was getting myself into. So I've been doing education research though now for 10 years. Oh my gosh. And I'll let Ellie introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm Ellie. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington in the biology department. Some really similar to Melissa, I actually trained as an ecologist also. I like to think that some of the problems that we encounter in ecology are actually really similar to the problems we encounter in education from a statistical perspective, right? Like plants are nested in plots, just like students are nested in classrooms, right? Plants, lots of things impact how they grow. Lots and lots of things impact how students experience our classrooms in the world. And so I also feel really at home here in discipline-based education research, using mostly quantitative methods to try to answer these questions. Before grad school, though, I was also a middle school and high school teacher for several years. So my love of teaching really in a lot of ways came before. Yeah.
I taught middle school.
Yeah. Anyway, so there we have it.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to talk about how to help you guys get started in education research. And so the first thing we're going to do are some introductions with you all. So nice job on the name tents, folks. They look great. But let's go around and since we have kind of a smallish group, we can all introduce ourselves, where you're at, and then what are your general education research interests? Like, what are you interested in, like learning, like studying, kind of just very generally, broadly? Do not have to give me a 10-minute version of it yet. That will come later. And if you have any experience, you should tell us. So we're trying to also do our audience. We will start. Let's start right here, and then we can go around.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard. I'm a third-year student at the University of Washington undergrad. Education research interest, and we are part of a group called Gray Matters Journal, and a big part of our mission is to make neuroscience education more accessible to kids through through K-12 education. And so I'm trying to learn more about how we can develop better either curriculums or activities. Is that what it's about here, or is it?
Well, it's kind of about like figuring. Yeah, it's about kind of assessing your curriculum and activities, right? Is this where is this leading to the outcomes that you're hoping for? Yeah.
I'm Eden. I'm a second-year undergrad at UW, and I'm also part of Gray Matters. But I think my part in Gray Matters is about, I guess, user accessibility and like the tech part, so like the website. And then maybe any future curriculum UI related stuff. So kind of doing more behind the scenes, but thinking about the user research and how that impacts the people.
Hi, my name is Oren. I am currently a software engineer at Microsoft. Prior to that, I was a research assistant in a few neuroscience labs, and I'm hoping to apply for a PhD this upcoming fall. And I've had a history of teaching in a variety of contexts. I've been a chess instructor, I've been a coding instructor, done a number of different kinds of things in that regime. Recently teaching people computational neuroscience tools. And so I'm really curious, but I also run a neuroscience journal club in Seattle. That's actually one of the motivating factors for being here is the attendance has not been amazing. And so I was curious to sort of learn about, especially with people who can't even read papers or something like that, how do you retain that audience? How do you get people excited about these topics that generally feel so high up there in the stratosphere for a lot of people?
I'm Rachel Penton. I am at the Allen Institute. I'm on our education engagement team. Previously, I was teaching faculty at UNC Chapel Hill. I taught undergrads neuroscience for about a decade. I've been doing some level of education research for about 5 years, which means I have a backlog of papers that I don't know will ever get published that are mostly about determining whether or not my students met the learning outcomes for the classes, as well as like gained some sort of transferable skills with the types of courses that I design. Currently, I'm interested in expanding that because I design workshops for folks. I want to actually assess those things for educators, and then like beyond that, help the educators then assess what they're designing with their students. And I also have a particular interest, and I don't know how to design it or anything, about looking at emergent outcomes for working with open data. And not just open data, like working with open science in general, because I think there's some stuff that if you don't know about it, you can't measure it. And there's a whole field on emergent outcomes that I'm interested in. So yeah.
I'm Julie Hill. I'm from Seattle. I work for a company called SciTech Biosciences. We make a flow cytometer. I am not a formal educator, but I've been involved in outreach education for a long time. My goal is to bring flow cytometry into classrooms, middle and high school and community colleges, small universities and such. So I'm just generally interested in cytometry education.
Awesome. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Maddie. I work here at the Allen Institute, and in the fall, I'm starting a PhD program in discipline-based education research. This is highly relevant to what my next 5 to 6 years will be. Yeah, some research interests are like I love qualitative research. I showed some of that yesterday. I hope to continue analyzing student impressions of science and society content, like ultimate hope of, being able to compare classes that have that content versus classes that don't and see if we see any differences. And a big goal for the PhD is to strengthen my quantitative skills. So, yeah.
I'm Julia. I work here at the Allen Institute as the Education Engagement Coordinator, and one thing that I'm interested in is learning more about how to research the impact of informal learning experiences on affective learning outcomes, especially around science identity in both the general public and then high school and undergrads.
Hi everyone, I'm Sumitra. I'm a postdoc in LU Theobald Lab, and I've been studying competition in undergraduate STEM classes. Yeah, both qualitatively and quantitatively a bit. And yeah, it's been really interesting to understand how students conceptualize competition. And now we're thinking more about how that competition impacts their affect and their performance in STEM classes. Variation. Yes, yes, that has made it, particularly challenging, but also incredibly. I think it just like emphasizes how much there is to understand, right, and how nuanced it is. Really. This is a professor of neurobiology. Education research interests or background. I feel like we were doing a PhD. And then in the last year, there was this one person who was postdoc did this thing called like biology education research. She was in neurobiology and behavior building. Very and then now suddenly out of nowhere, education research is like this thing, which I feel like, I partly participated in many ways, and I think I'm really interested in learning more about it as a formalized field, some intentions, how to get involved, how to put stuff out. Project I have in mind is I developed this curriculum for students to think about decolonial theory in neuroscience, and I want to like share that and also let the students would love tools. Yeah.
I'm a fourth year undergrad, University of Washington, and I'm also part of the Gray Matters Journal, more involved in production. And then there's Oren.
Yes.
Yes, similar to Oren, I think going into next year, due to my leadership role, I kind of want to focus more on like giving an introduction to like tackling research papers, which I know can be like really daunting as a high schooler going into college, and then like keeping them engaged and like interested in like learning about it. So yeah.
We'll talk.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Noah Courtney. I am a post-bac right now with the Lamary Lab at Texas Tech. I have some background in discipline-based education research. I've been doing bioed for about 2 years now. And my focus, like my talk yesterday, is on community college bioed. Some of the questions I'm curious about looking at are students' persistence through failure and what their achievement orientation goals are as far as being performance or mastery oriented in terms of their goals, how that relates to their persistence through failure, but also persistence through transferring to a four-year program.
Terry Stelson. I'm at I'm Bastyr University here and North Seattle College, a community college. So so I'm not a researcher, you know, I'm an educator, but I'm very interested in like the learning sciences, and I've been following kind of research that's been going on. And my background is more like evolutionary ecology and animal behavior, and I used to do a lot of like behavior modification stuff with dogs and things. So like for me, I just see, so I see these parallels that I think not everybody is privy to, I guess. So anyway, just in terms of what I'm very interested in kind of thinking about like what are the outcomes that we're measuring in education, you know, and like how do we determine what those outcomes are, right? So you can look at like how much does the student learn, but is that what you're, you know, in an 11-week course, is that the outcome that you want? I'm interested in every aspect.
Great questions. All right.
Hi, everyone. Greg Crowther, Everett Community College, where I teach A&P, Anatomy and Physiology. So in some ways, I'm sort of a veteran lurking here. I've, you know, in a sense, done a bunch of education research over the years, first on educational music and more recently on summative assessments. But I feel like I've published a lot despite a lack of good skills. So
Wow,
still trying to learn.
Inspiring.
Yeah. So I try and learn from people like Ellie and Melissa whenever I can. So
I'm Sam Donovan, and my scientific training's in ecology and evolution, but my PhD is in science education. And so I've done some research. I am really interested in a couple of aspects around how computation acts as a thinking tool for students, and how faculty development, how faculty identity as professional practitioners influences their practice.
Great. So we've got a diverse group here, which is great. All right, so our workshop goals. The first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about different forms of education scholarship and have you think about what kind of education scholarship you're trying to pursue, because they lead down slightly different paths. Then we're going to actually have you work on formulating a research question and hypothesis to investigate. Some of you may already have things in mind. Some of you may be like, I don't know, but that's okay because you can use this as an exercise to kind of go through the process. We'll talk about creating a plan for ethical data collection and then wrap up by talking about some next steps for education scholarship. All right, so this is a think, pair, share. So we all have various interests, and we probably all have very different motivations and purposes for collecting data. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think, why are you interested in collecting education data? What's your motivation? And then we'll have a pair share. All right, so 30 seconds on the clock. Think, what's your purpose? You can have multiple purposes.
Triple share.
Triplet share.
Yeah, you do not have to do that.
So you can think of education data as like, I don't know, anything related to teaching, learning, students, professors.
Yeah, no writing, no speaking.
All right, so 30 seconds, share out, you can just share at your tables with the people around you. What is the purpose for collecting your education data? What are you hoping to do with it? To learn from it?
Yeah.
It's fine. I also.
Everyone has.
Yeah, I think those are the purposes, one
Yeah.
for, you know, keeping the professor on the payroll. But also providing really helpful feedback on how to improve the class
Yeah.
tailored to the needs of that population at the time. I think,
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd be interested in.
Why would you collect data?
Yeah, right.
Staff is very exclusive and by me.
80% complete, like, towards the gal will give you 0.2%.
I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
How we should that and should partner as in speaking up more about studying it for students.
So it's a.
What do you think the best?
It's a reality.
Yeah, I
Thing that I, maybe it's too
I
specific,
think
but.
some of it is actually departmental need for it. For
I think you.
my philosophy professor was saying that the philosophy
Education research to me gives me.
truthfully poor rates, of course, you know.
Wow.
Because they don't really.
No, I have lots of reasons. So, I mean, I feel like I have a lot of ideas that
And I can't.
I'm convinced are brilliant. But collecting data allows me to test, like, are they really brilliant? Or do I just think they are?
Right.
And then if they are, let's say, good,
You'd also have lots of time to discuss things today. So hopefully you guys have, is anyone here, who here is using this as an opportunity to improve their own teaching? Right. Who is like thinking I want to go big with this and I want to inform the education community more broadly. All right. Okay. So. The purpose of why you're collecting data can kind of lead you into thinking about what type of education scholarship you have. And so we actually found this figure, Ellie and I, from a paper published by Columbia University. It was a white paper. And it's kind of a nice way to think about different types of education scholarship. And you can think of, there's lots of people who are doing teaching, right? And of those subset of people, though, there are some who are doing more scholarly teaching. And scholarly teaching, really here, these people are collecting data for the purpose of improving their teaching. And a lot of times it's really for personal use, right? It's like, I am trying something new in my course and I want to know if it's going to work and whatever that means, right? And so I'm going to collect some data and then you can make changes or you might find that it's really great already. Or maybe you want to even use it in personal documents, going up for promotion, tenure. Then you can think that there is kind of a subset within scholarly teaching of people who are engaged in the scholarship of teaching and learning, which we call SOTL. Again, the purpose is really to improve one's teaching as well as to maximize student learning. But it goes beyond simply thinking about using the data yourself. It's really thinking about having dissemination to other instructors in mind. You want to share what you're finding much more widely. You think there are practitioners who are going to find what you're doing useful. And then there is kind of a subset in there of people who are doing discipline-based education research. And here, the purpose is also to improve one's teaching and maximize student learning, but it's to go a little bit further too. And here people are thinking about how they can contribute to conceptual and theoretical models of teaching and learning. So really getting into like that education field. And so dissemination here is partly publishing findings for instructors, because that's very important, but also publishing findings for the context of people who are studying education. So no matter where you are in this kind of type of scholarship you're interested in pursuing, you're going to follow the general investigative process, which is very common in science. And so everyone kind of starts by making an observation in the classroom. You guys all were talking about education research interests. A lot of these have stemmed from things you've noticed, right? And so this helps you formulate the problem that you want to investigate, which will lead to the identification of a research question. Here's where it starts to diverge a little bit based on whether you're scholarly teaching, SOTL, DBER. If you're just interested in whether something works in your classroom, you don't have to go digging into the literature super deeply. You don't have to try and understand and learn theory and situate it within that, right? You're trying to figure this out. If it works, you can just design a study around that. If you are planning on going kind of in that SOTL or DBER direction, though, where you're going to be publishing things more generally, you do have to think about what has already been done. What do we already know about this? What do we know about how things work? And for DBER, theory is very important. How you design your study will also differ depending upon what your purpose is. If you're interested in just collecting data, again, to figure out whether something's working in your classroom, the kinds of questions that you ask students, for instance, on a survey can be pretty general, whereas if you are going to publish this more broadly, the kinds of questions that you ask in a survey have to be backed up with validity evidence. So it becomes much more rigorous, right, once you're moving into those broader dissemination stages. And this becomes very important to IRB review, which I will talk about on the next couple slides. Again, regardless of what you're doing, you will collect data, you will analyze your data, which I think is the most fun part of the whole scientific process, synthesize your results, and finally, dissemination. This is, again, where we diverge, right? You have different audiences depending upon the purpose of your data. Okay, so I do want to insert something about IRB. This is so very important to think about. So when there's any research with human subjects, including education, including biomedical, your study has to go through review from the institutional review board. And every institution, at least larger institutions, have an institutional review board. And so they oversee all research with human subjects. But the key word here is research, because not everything that involves data collection actually falls under research. And so examples of research include anything that is federally funded as a research project, right? Obviously, that's research. Undergraduate and graduate theses and dissertations count as research. Any projects where the results will be shared, so disseminated at conferences or disseminated through publications, right, to contribute to generalizable knowledge. But there are times when data might be collected that it's not considered research and no IRB is necessary. If you have your students do a survey and then they analyze those results and they're only presenting it to you as the instructor for a grade, there's no IRB needed generally. However, if you decide that you then want to present it at the undergraduate research conference, an IRB would be needed, right? So slight differences. If again, you're just collecting data because you want to make your course better, or maybe you are a program coordinator for a major and you want to have some survey questions for students to try to improve that major, right? As long as you're just using it yourself for that improvement, you don't need IRB. Right, and there can be other kind of departmental or university administrative purposes for not needing IRB.
I feel like this could make it a really tough barrier for any educator that really wants to publish what they want to do.
So yes, and in fact, some small institutions, in particular if you're at a community college, might not have IRBs. And so this is challenging because when you publish, you do have to acknowledge, actually many journals now will make you check a box that says, I have IRB to do this. And if you are at a place where you do not have an IRB, for instance, you're not at an institution, or you're maybe at a community college that doesn't have one, you need to work on partnering with someone at an institution that does have an IRB. Yes. Are there? Yeah. Okay, thank you, Sam. But yeah, so the other thing is this also gray areas. I often am like, I don't know, IRB, no IRB. You should always talk to someone in IRB because they will help you figure it out. Really, the go-to is, if you're not sure, put it in an IRB. If you think there's even a chance you want to share your results at a conference, put in an IRB, because the last thing you want is to collect some data that shows this really cool outcome, and then you're like, oh, I never got consent from my participants. So the IRB is important for a couple of reasons. It helps make sure that all studies with human subjects adhere to ethical principles. That being said, it's not going to ensure that your research is completely ethical. Like, there are still things you need to keep in mind as the researcher, which we are going to talk about later. But it is kind of a baseline. It is required for obtaining and renewing grants. It is required for presenting and publishing your work. And also it does give protection to investigators and institutions, because participants will have to consent. Part of IRB is figuring out how you're going to get your participants to consent to allow their data to be used. And the IRB process definitely varies institution to institution, which can make it challenging when working across institutions for sure. But it generally involves submitting a packet. It's going to have some background. It's going to have your research question and a very detailed plan for data collection. It's going to ask you to whether there's risk to your participants for like harm. The good thing about education is generally very minimal risk. And then, they'll ask if there's like direct benefits or adverse effects on students, and things like that. But again, the actual what you turn in depends upon your institution. And then once you turn that packet in of information, it goes through review. There are different levels of review. The lowest level is exempt review. This does not mean it's actually exempt from review, by the way, just called exempt review. This is when you're collecting anonymous data and the study poses minimal risk to participants. So you collect anonymous data about students' interest in microbiology topics. Pretty not risky. Then there's expedited review. So this is where the data is not anonymous. So if you collect student names, student IDs, if you do focus groups, right, and you have multiple students that are like you're asking questions to at one time, that's not anonymous. There are multiple students there, right? So that goes through expedited review as long as there's minimal risk, like you're not really posing a lot of harm to the well-being of your participants. And then full review, I've never been here because it's more than minimal risk and or using vulnerable populations, which involves children. So that might be something if anyone's doing informal education, or prisoners are another vulnerable population. Pregnant people.
Asking your students to cross a tightrope.
Asking students to walk a tightrope between buildings would be more than minimal risk. Yeah, so then it goes through full review with the entire IRB board. Do you have questions about IRB before I move on? Yeah.
So I didn't have a question. It's a comment because at a conference.
Yes.
Thanks so much for putting this up. A lot of times in workshops, people are like, just go ask your IRB. I'm not going to talk about it. And so y'all talking about this very clearly was super helpful.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if Sam will know, given the use of the third party thing, like, are there like initiatives basically that like try to fill in these gaps, or are they just like, another IRB, but they just happen to not be associated with an institution.
It's still a little world.
Yeah.
You know, it's like pharmaceutical regulation for experiments. So at the BioQuest Curriculum Consortium, a nonprofit, we don't have an IRB board. If we partner with a university or something, we can use theirs. But on our own, we just go to a third party, pay a little bit of money, and they rubber stamp you. It's all surveys. But yes, you can, but they have to be certified, and that's a big process.
How expensive is it, Sam?
We found it to be kind of variable. So we found a place to do $700.
Okay.
Not bad.
Not bad. Yeah.
For collaborative research, so like if you guys collaborated, would both university IRBs have to approve? And what would happen if like one said exempt and the other said expedited?
Oh my God. Oh, this is where it gets so complicated.
It's exciting.
It is, you know, and part of it is since there's no one way to do IRB, right? Every institution has different rules. But if Ellie and I were collaborating, we would both have to have IRB approval. There are things that can happen if your universities play nice with each other that will allow approval at one institution and then the other one just kind of piggybacks on it. But not all institutions like to do that. And so then it becomes.
Gosh, now I'm wondering, like I worked with a consortium for like fMRI data with like 50 different universities. I don't know how that works out. That sounds terrifying.
So I'm working on a project right now
Yeah.
with, we have 40 institutions. We are the only researchers. That's not true. I have a collaborator who's also a researcher. I have IRB. We received exempt status from the University of Washington IRB. My collaborator received exempt status from University of Minnesota. We are the only two who can touch the data. The only two institutions. And actually my IRB, that IRB status covers everybody at the University of Washington who wants to deal with my data.
Whoa.
This is the fun thing about IRB, right? It's actually federally regulated and locally instantiated, which is bananas. and so different IRBs, University of Washington has an enlightened IRB. They're amazing to work with. I call them all the time. They always give dinner recommendations. They're amazing. And that's not necessarily true with all IRBs. I would say, like, just like what Melissa was saying, like, just talk to the IRB who's at your place. Because the other thing too is the University of Washington, like, let's say I like think I've been doing something right in my classroom for the last 10 years. And now I'm like, I think that actually was something real. I can actually go back and look at those data, look at those student outcomes in a retrospective analysis. My IRB considers it kind of like a chart review in the medical field, right? I'm not doing anything prospective. I don't actually need consent from any of my students because they're long gone.
Yeah.
But there's different things I have to do with the data to look at them. And so there's lots of an extreme amount of nuance.
Extreme.
This is the reason you talk to the IRB, because they'll tell you which boxes to check and which boxes not to check.
Exactly.
Because they book different reviews.
Exactly.
Also, if you're at the opposite side of it, you're a collaborator.
Yeah.
And researchers are at an institution. First question is, hey, can you tell me about your IRB approval? Because it's not fun to like potentially get down a path and then be like, wait a minute, I thought you were the researcher and you were responsible for that. So it's
That's
definitely
good
like
to know.
across all collaboration, it's very important.
Okay.
All right. So we are going to get you now thinking, kind of after that overview, about your own education problem that you want to tackle. And so we have put these questions onto your handouts. So you can kind of like an outline of kind of a way to think about building a research project. So the first question we're going to have you answer, first two, is what's the education problem you are trying to tackle? Right? So this might like think about the context. And then not your research question hypothesis, just the general education problem. What is the problem? And then what type of education scholarship do you see yourself pursuing and why? So we'll give you 2 minutes to kind of write in on your handouts.
Realistic of all.
Yes, pick the most realistic. Because we're gonna move this forward and like build research questions and data collection. Section 2, yes, on your handout. I'd also mention that this is Ellie and I's interpretation of of these categories. Is there's no like one like this is clearly scholarly teaching. It's clearly deeper. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you, even if you haven't quite finished up, that's okay. Take a minute or so to just chat with a couple of people. You can do it in pairs. Or if you can do it in groups of 3, there's an uneven number at your table. What's your problem you're trying to tackle, and where do you see yourself in this
Table.
circle?
Yes. Okay.
But then
Well, I'm interested in yours.
yeah, okay.
I was leading the study our organization. So I was
What is your
yes. Classroom setting, methods, and how that can catch up with the
So
What or allows me to quantify what
Competition.
Yeah.
What did you?
of course.
Renee, when I have the things I want to it doesn't do anything.
Right, and you identified number of topics. They're just. And I expecting. Is that involved? I don't know.
honestly, never lost.
Yeah.
Motivating desire there, like you feel like it's really competitive and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I especially like I imagine medical school, things of that nature, like you're almost incentivized to be hitting each other. So,
Like just one better.
Got that.
And I think it's very wide.
Because I do think
You said all the words that are in our current scale. Wow.
Pattern of things, they all relate to the club because they're different. But we have opportunities for chapters to sprout up. And so how do we support the chapters and building their own Gray Matters branch? In addition to how do we
unless I play or
production process?
that's when I act. I don't know how to do it in an intellectual context, but it turns on when I get into games. So I do actually feel like I'm invested in weirdly rounded up.
Kind of the slides and how we actually interact.
Never
with
ever
our-
any context.
And I think it's like.
Yeah.
Maybe another minute. Another minute? You want another minute? Okay, all right, we have a request for just a smidge more time to discuss this. We're gonna compromise 45 seconds.
I'll negotiate.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. That's really
good questions.
It is definitely. But it's also contextual, right? Like I don't have it in all context. Jumped out.
Talked about it.
Get our anatomy students to raw and see if that helps them retain the material for longer.
Right.
I mean, like, get high grades, if we just give them a test, whether or not they.
Right, like, rather than I'm going to then competing or not is a choice. And
The things that they drew, do they better?
but are people aware of the whole.
Yeah.
And how that
Yeah.
influences the next
Like the game thing really does that. Like when I play competitive games, I'm a big chess player. You just know the other person doing the same thing. And sometimes I like sit there and try to contextualize.
My essay is
What if I just try to imagine that I'm trying to hear the best outcome for both players, right? Rather than me against, you know, when it's work.
Sorry.
Is my default.
What I want to do is I want to push along. Don't worry, you will still have time to talk because the next part is really kind of digging in a little bit more specifically. Just out of curiosity, wait, how many of you are in the scholarly teaching bin? Right. How many of you are thinking Sodal? Woo! And how many of you are thinking Deaver? Woo! Yay! All right. See, all of these are good purposes. They're all good.
How to avoid the IRBs.
It's not that bad.
Really not that bad. Especially if you're doing stuff that's exams.
So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about getting you started, and you all have a problem that you've kind of outlined that you want to investigate. And so we're going to talk about, first of all, what you're specifically interested in exploring by making you come up with a research question. Then we can talk about who will I be collecting data from? What data will I collect? This is the hardest question to answer. And how and when will data collection take place? So we'll give you time to think about a data collection plan. And we will touch on this at the very end if we have time. How do I plan to share the results of my study? Ways of dissemination. All right, so we're just going to get into it. Research question hypothesis. All right, so I'm going to give you guys 3 minutes. Specific research question. Here's the thing. You can write multiple research questions. And this is a draft because Ellie is going to be talking about data collection. And as Sam talked about in his talk, that process of science, this is not a linear process. We create research questions, we come up with data collection plans, we realize our research questions are not really what we want, right? So there will be time to revise your research question. So 3 minutes though, a research question or research question is a hypothesis. All right. Now's your chance. What I want you to do is share it with someone next to you. Feedback. What I want the other person to do is to listen to that research question hypothesis. And if you have feedback, provide it. Like, is there a way to improve that research question? Is it like, do you have questions? Like, is it a little vague and you want to ask some questions that might help people narrow down what they really mean by that research question or that hypothesis, okay? You have 5 minutes, which means 2.5 minutes per person, and I am timing this.
We have an uneven number here,
Maybe
so
feedback,
maybe
okay.
we'll just
So,
fix the trim tactics of the.
But I'd love to like.
I want to know what the question to which the hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. So I started with the whole hypothesis of
You could go
how do you
first.
get people completely unfamiliar with this science versus to engage in meaningful, relevant conversations based on something. The first thing that I thought of is simply what is the primary barrier to reading papers for I think that's too vague of a question. My answer is first the inability to understand how the hypothesis, the inability to understand how to parse their paper. But I imagine it's not necessarily true of everyone can be the abstract there. So my second question is, what's the first base spiral to reading a paper when you stop? And my hypothesis was that you start at the abstract, but I don't know that. And then generally would probably stop at the intro, at least what you do in usually, like real life thing, and then it's like, okay, I can get behind this, and then you get to the method, you're like, how do you get people to stop? How do you try to engage with methods or understand how to gloss over ideas that don't really, but just to start, is that hypothesis, like, people get stuck? What are the methods? If they get stuck, and then you need to get beyond even that, like, how do you get them to engage?
Assessing which for me, I would go toward.
What are the outcomes? How do you actually measure this with one of those? Open science, right? And then you need those other.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that in a second. I'm not sure. Like, but
If there's something
That
about
was-
primary question, currently very sending you with all the how do you get there? I was in it. And that's different, right? Like, what are the barriers?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then,
And I have
my own hypothesis.
Yeah.
but please share your
like,
I think it's like making it-
I don't know what the main is. I don't know what you're interested in.
Yeah.
Right, to compare,
Yeah.
like, understand,
Yeah.
right? So I'm thinking about
Identity.
abstract.
There is
Switched
identity.
off talking with the other, letting the other person talk about their research question hypothesis. Make sure you do.
I just wrote down a smattering, so I'll just read them out. But how do Gray Matters production members perceive the writing and editing process in alignment with their peers? Because they come into their club for their own reason. Mentorship and writing opportunity.
I can think that.
What, goal
Right, and so leveraging that.
What do you think? Smaller question, but
What are
the option I'm in at the moment is, just applying anatomical things longer.
Then that's fine. And then the third thing that
They would. Whether they do something or not, they want a good grade, so they tend to score relatively well. And then, several weeks later, once we're in that module, be the piece.
there's something like that.
Drawn get retained somewhat better. I mean, it'll be decay regardless, but maybe there'll be less decay on the things that
Yeah, go ahead. We haven't heard.
Yeah.
So we just say, listen to this very.
Give them all the images and it was like.
So what's the, like, what is summarizing, what is? Yeah, what is?
My research question is
You have 15 seconds left.
So like
First, yeah, it's 15 seconds.
by entering YouTube into the platform. Like accessibility to upscale their different context. Yeah, right.
Okay, so there are like two contexts kind of intersection.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, so we bring us all back together. So hopefully you had some good discussions around research question hypothesis. This is your starting point, right? So it's a draft. And so we're going to start talking about data collection. And so I'm going to turn this over to Ellie now.
Awesome. Thanks. So we're an hour and 6 minutes in. Do you all want a break? We had planned it for about an hour. Yes. Okay. So yes, 4 minutes. That's it. All right. So see you back here at 2:40. Drinks have to stay on the carpet or outside in the room.
And food is outside.
What's carpet?
That one right in the back.
Right in the very back of the room.
Yeah, just right here, but only right here or outside.
Lab space.
Uh-huh.
Nobody should want to.
Understood.
Yeah, we don't.
Feels illegal.
Yeah, it is. Back that we places of fight.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that we could have workshops in here and have it be more.
Well, you guys have all the outlets, which make me really happy.
Oh, yeah, that was the demand
Yeah,
that we made for this space.
It's very
that is good.
But yeah.
I wanted to see what your research question was. You were writing some.
I was reading lots. I've bracketed everything that I.
Through the steps of the transfer process. Have
That's
you heard
bracketed
of,
for a reason.
This is why my brain is not working today.
I was talking a little bit about, well, so we ended up kind of reframing a little bit, but the first thing I thought was like the primary barrier to reading papers.
And that everything that's bracketed is bracketed because
I started thinking about it more
I know
detail,
that
like what
that
the
part of
first
my
section
research
you try to
question
read,
Or it needs to be guided by theory, but I don't have all the.
Which of the sections do you not read?
Like, yeah, looking at.
But even that's kind of difficult, is how much do they really read each section?
Yeah.
I was of the assumption they would go abstract,
Best
intro,
ways
stop,
to
thesis,
Just
but the point was also
Like,
about,
thought about, like,
you know, she was
I
mentioning.
think there's a lot of value in
like,
being able to really.
or the reverse was talking about, how do you get people to want to read? That's the first thing. It's not even that they are trying to.
Professors who want to.
Exactly, also, right, and then.
I'm also torn because I'm like.
Interested in research. Also, and then like, yeah, then given your interest, how do you go about trying to read things?
I can ask about the trend.
So I think that was a good way. If I ask this question, someone that's never bothered to try to read a paper won't be able to tell anything.
especially, you know.
I think that's what we struggled a
I think
lot.
I'd be the first friend that.
Seriously?
There is
I think about my green giant and stuff.
Yeah.
I know.
And I mean,
I came over here to that question for you.
I love it.
Related to what I was writing.
Good.
That you know, wait a minute.
Yeah.
It's like.
community college.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of community college specific
I
that are
think honestly,
really.
the involved thing that I
Like then when you
was,
try and get into like.
club at least.
Yeah.
The problem is that when there's.
Yeah, so.
I don't know, we.
Journal of Higher Education has a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What is
And
that?
then community college.
Right, so that's where I'm starting, because it's not
But
even.
it's not specific or specific
Yeah.
to.
So it's just people coming in, how do I get them?
Does this talk about adept students or does this talk about biology?
Like,
And it's more just getting people engaged in neuroscience.
very
topics.
non-intensive.
And that can take a lot of work. So I realize the
Anyways,
barrier
literature.
is lower in the real world.
Cool. I love it.
And these are
I know, it's an important.
educated people, usually engineers.
I'm meeting the transfer students on Friday to offer them scholarship money.
Like, really, don't worry, I did it.
It's been so hard. Down. It's been so hard to track them down. Like, yeah.
Human age is-
That's down.
Connection.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
I think the format depends. Like, I think one thing that we really stressed was community college. I think it's hybrid, so you're just gonna
Community college.
Yeah.
But,
Considering.
yeah, I think,
That is a part.
I am the de facto only presenter all the time.
so it's like, trying to keep it consistent. Like, yeah, on that was on a Monday through Tuesday.
Yeah.
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 Try.
Yeah, at least we have a recurring date to meet up, so it's on the calendar. So I didn't do any. Yeah, the hard part is no one else really knows much about neuroscience, but it's something I want to do and like to do, just sort of like keeping thing on keeping it. And so I'm trying to figure out almost interesting. I can show you my current, I'm literally getting it today.
Yeah, so this is how I've been doing it. I've been working with our
So,
advising office.
yeah, literally leaving here and I go right to,
Fridays.
you know, I try to find topics that I've invested a lot of time into, and how can they be like fun to people? So psychoactive drugs is one that I've studied psychopharmacology, modeling, things like that. And so like a lot of people think drugs, so it's like it's a relevant question to anyone. Yeah, what's this drug doing? You know. The other thing is I used to teach a data science in college, and
Let's come back together as a whole group.
it's like, it has to be just a lot of ideas. Everything has to be like a
it's
question that gets one to try to answer it.
Okay. I think
Yeah.
maybe not quite. Oh yeah, everyone's back or close. Totally awesome. Thank you. Obviously, feel free if you feel free to leave again if you must. The basic plan for the second half now of the workshop is really to go from pretty broad, like how are you going to do it? How are you going to collect the data? What's your sample population? How are you going to know these are the correct data to collect? It turns out that like a workshop in the broadly how to get started in education research could go in 1,000 different directions. We decided to go in this direction. It might feel a little like we're shifting gears without putting in the clutch well, but hopefully it'll be okay. So how we're gonna start by thinking about if the creating a data collection plan is really to think about if the question you just wrote is answerable. If it's not, that's fine. That's where the drafting process comes in. And we've developed this framework to help us know if your question is answerable. So the framework is printed in totality, starting on page 5, with a bunch of notes also, partly because there's 0% chance we're gonna get to become deeper experts in the next 45 minutes, but there's plenty of notes for you to refer back to later. In addition, as we're working through this framework, we're gonna work through an example, one of my absolute favorite papers, actually written by Sarah Eddy and Kelly Hogan, published in 2014. And so that is on page 2 of the worksheet. So there might be a certain amount of flipping back and forth. Okay, so to think about if our question is answerable, again, this framework that we've developed, really there's 3, like if for a question to be answerable, the question, you have to have a testable hypothesis, right? And to understand if your hypothesis is testable, there's really 3, we have decided that there are 3 buckets that need 3 things that you need to think about or that need to be met for your hypothesis to be testable. So what you're looking at needs to be measurable, has to be justifiable, and there's a handful of pitfalls for sure that are worth avoiding. So again, some of this, we're like, in this part, we're kind of starting to push a little bit closer into SOTL and deeper a little bit. It still applies to scholarly teaching, of course, but it's maybe a little bit less strict for scholarly teaching. So again, we're going to work through each of these 3 buckets together. So when we're thinking about if you have a testable hypothesis, your data need to be measurable and outcomes need to be measurable. Some things to think about. So first of all, your Y variable, your outcome needs to be meaningful, right? It needs to matter to somebody. Okay, if it's just your X, and it needs to differentiate, right? You have to have variation in your outcome variable in order to understand what's happening. And what you're trying to do then with your X variables, or the additional things you're measuring, whether it's your treatment or various student characteristics or characteristics of the participants, whether they're the faculty or the public. Again, those X variables need to be meaningful and differentiate between different conditions. So both Melissa and I are quantitative researchers, and so that is a lens through which we see the world, unfortunately. Right? And when we're building out this framework, I don't think that we think that all of this actually applies to qualitative research as well. That's not really our expertise, but we still tossed in a couple of nods to qualitative work. I'm so sorry. I'm really glad Maddie's joining the group to help me become aware with qualitative research. Okay, so again, right, when you're thinking about whether your outcome is measurable, it could either be in quantitative data or even in the codes in the code book you use to understand the qualitative responses that students are giving. And same thing, you might want to add in some additional questions for your participants to either quantitatively control for things or measure additional things, or qualitatively as well. Similarly, as you're thinking about your X variables and your Y variables, you need to be thinking about confounders and then controls that will block those confounders. So confounding variable in quantitative speak is anything that's correlated both with your outcome and your predictor. So in the case of students in classrooms, if you're interested in how well students are going to do on this particular assessment, you need to take into account some amount of prior knowledge that they have, whether it's prior classes that they've taken, prior performance and various metrics, right? So that whether or not they're in treatment A or B is independent of some of these prior characteristics. And we use control variables then in our models to block those confounding variables. Okay, in this also, of course, because it's a data collection plan, you need to be thinking about and iteratively redesigning and redesigning your sample, your instrument, how you're going to measure these various things, the actual data that you'll have and your power, right? If you want it powered like in reference to your sample size and how, if you have a large enough sample to really answer your question effectively. Okay, so then when you, as you're thinking through all of this, you can test whether or not you have a testable hypothesis in terms of the measurable outcomes and data if you can draw a hypothetical figure for what your data are going to look like if your data support your hypothesis, support a null hypothesis, or if you can, reject some sort of hypothesis. So let's work through this with the Eddy and Hogan paper. So again, you can follow along on page 2. So Eddy and Hogan is a really fun paper. They wanted to know how and for whom does high structure work. So this is thinking about high structure in introductory biology classes.
What's high structure?
Yes, really good question. So their paper describes it in a lot of detail, but kind of in a nutshell, high structure is it's actually often conflated with active learning, but it's quite different. High structure is the extra things that instructors provide in this context, extra things that instructors provide to help students meet the learning objectives. So it's things like, in my class, for example, it's things like the readiness questions or the reading quizzes that do before they come to class. It's the practice exams that they have to do before the exams. It's homework problems or lab assignments, things like that, so that it's not just like the move to high structure classes is really a move away from just a few high stakes exams. Yeah.
So then high structure is kind of, I'm thinking of it as a very top down when I hear structure, but it sounds like it's more like giving students more opportunity, like really encouraging the practice and the studying, giving them credit for that. Yeah. So there could be flexibility within that.
Absolutely. Yep. And flexibility actually turns out to be really important for students too. Yeah. I also sometimes think about high structure. Like if you think of a ladder, I want students to get to the ceiling here. And if I only have high stakes exams and maybe only have 3 rungs on that ladder, that lets students get there. But a high structure course would maybe have 15 rungs where like you do this thing, you get a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, something like that.
I'm curious. I'm curious on how you quantify that.
Okay, yeah, there's tons of really great ways. So in this Eddy and Hogan paper, we're not actually going to go into that really at all for the purpose of this, but they had 3 different treatments. They had low structure, medium structure, high structure. The low structure had none of these things. Like read your textbook, come to class, take an exam. The medium structure class, they added, I'm pretty sure medium structure, they added practice exam, or they added the pre-reading and no practice exams. High structure, they added pre-reading, practice exams, and maybe like in-class questions or something, which is like a borderline between active learning and high structure. Right, it's conflated. Do you remember what else they? Is that not remember? Is that about right? Okay, something like that. It's a really great paper, actually, and thanks for asking. There's a list of references in the back, the very last page, and the Eddy and Hogan paper is listed there, and CBE is an open access journal, so again.
And Ellie and Vigi Staffy also have their inclusive teaching book, which really goes into what high structure is, how it can be used for more inclusive classrooms, and they have checklists for your teaching.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really great book. Okay, cool. Any other questions? This is great. Okay, I love it. Okay, so here we go. So their paper, so their question. Hold on, there we go. Okay, their question was, does high structure increase student performance? And their hypothesis was that high structure actually disproportionately benefits first generation students compared to continuing generation students. So these are students whose parents did not go to college or did not complete. Again, to work through this flow chart to make sure that their data were measurable or the outcome was meaningful and differentiates, and same with their predictors. Their outcome variable was the total exam points in these classes. Their variable of interest was whether it was in the high structure course or the low structure course. They also had a medium structure. We're ignoring that for now. Worth reading the paper. And then another variable of interest was whether or not a student identified as a first generation student or a continuing generation student for their first generation status. So, oh yes, what I want you to do right now is I want you to talk to each other and think about in this design, what might be a confounding variable. So again, a confounding variable is something that's correlated with either of your x variables and your y variable. So in this case, what are some possible confounding variables? Go ahead and talk to each other just for a second.
Something else with copy.
Yeah.
Like higher structure.
Just an example.
First generation.
Yeah, I think,
Totally.
amount of other classes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, types of responses.
Students are
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, full-time, part-time, part-time jobs.
The effect of like students who.
Yeah, just-
Now we have fighters, right?
More stuff.
I think I was over.
More stuff. Being first generation.
So I am not an interrupter by nature, actually, like deeply at all. This is my least favorite part of teaching. But yet here we are. I also am very good at not giving anywhere near enough time to work through. So, here we are. We're in it together. Okay.
You gotta talk twice as fast.
Yeah. Well, I'm really good at talking. Okay, so again, a confounding variable is anything that's related to your x variable and your y variable. In this case, Eddie and Hogan decided that which year it was is going to be, could potentially be related to how well students do on exams and whether they're not in a high structure or low structure class, right? Because what they did was in some years they had high structure and some years they had low structure. And as we all know in this particular political climate, year matters, right? Like what is happening around us impacts us deeply. Similarly, they decided prior performance was something that they really wanted to control for because again, maybe it's just the case that in one class, in your low structure class, you just happen to have students who are really, really, really good students. That's awesome, but that's going to confound your effect of high structure if you don't control for that. What were some other things? Yeah, Oren, thanks.
I thought of, well, I tutor some high school students that are first generation.
Yeah.
And a student wrote a really good essay about just language barrier stuff. So having more content to deal with can actually reduce your performance.
Absolutely, yeah. So in this study, actually, Eddie and Hogan controlled for the content by doing this experiment in the same class. And so nothing about the content actually changed, but that's a really important factor. And you could maybe see that come through too on the exams, or you might want to have the exact same exam questions potentially. Yeah. So one's not a little bit more wordy or whatever. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, great. Rachel, yeah.
Like hidden curriculum around how to take exams.
Yeah, totally. So all that hidden curriculum around how to take exams, like if it's a multiple choice exam, right? How you identify distractors maybe or whatever. Same if it's an open-ended question, like how do you form sentences, right? That, or like what is the instructor looking for in terms of the sentence structure and sentence formation? Yeah, good. What else? Yeah.
Extracurriculars and credit hours.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like the workload, right? Like our students in the high structure class just happen to also be taking a zillion other classes. Yeah, whereas in the low structure classes is the only class they're taking. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, last one, Trey.
Demographics, like, are you the only first generation student? Are you the only person who looks like you in the class? Those will make it harder to.
Exactly. Some of these additional identities that students bring into the classroom. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I will say actually, one thing I really appreciate about Deeper is we're really kind of moving away from this kind of study that just looks at differences between single identities. We know a lot more now about intersectional identities. Yeah, totally agree. Okay. Awesome. So what Eddie and Hogan did was they used year and prior performance in the same class, identical exams in all of these treatments. Okay, super. I was just coming to Melissa. I usually use PowerPoint, not Google Slides, so actually am not positive what slide's next. So won't that be fun? Adventure for all of it. Okay, here we go. Oh yeah, ethical considerations. Yeah, this is, so the study that Sarah and Kelly did had IRB oversight. And again, like as we're thinking about ethics in the context of education research, whether it's SOTL, scholarly teaching, DBER, really the heart of the ethical issue is really how can we minimize risk to participants? So there's 3 questions that I want you to think about and talk about with each other. So one, and you can think about it in the Eddie and Hogan context, or you can think about it in your own context in these research questions and hypotheses that you have articulated. So one is, how will you collect and handle data that's FERPA protected? It turns out grades are FERPA protected. Identities are FERPA protected, so their students' first generation status, their veteran status, their gender status, all of these. So how are you going to collect and handle those data? Second, how will you ask your students about a marginalized identity, right? We can't just like blaze into a classroom and be like, yo, tell me your dirtiest secrets. That's like not okay, right? So, but there are ways still to ask questions about identity or about their experiences, and to do that without triggering stereotypes or imposter syndrome, or to minimize those risks even more. And then third, while you're working with student level data, how are you going to manage your own and minimize your own biases, right? If these are students in your classroom who are now disclosing things to you, either in writing or even on checkboxes, how are you as an instructor and researcher going to manage that? How are you going to protect student identities if you can identify individuals? Okay, think about those questions just for a second on your own. And then in like 45 seconds or 30 seconds or so, we'll talk to each other. I will say too, these are just some of the ethical considerations here. I'm sure there's more also. And so there's a spot on the handout to write about some additional potential ethical considerations.
From here.
Awesome. Yeah, we're right that too. Yeah, there's no other place where these questions are written. Absolutely. Yeah, we're not going to collect these either. For sure. And grade them. We're going to grade them like on your way out for sure.
Actually using this for the data collection.
100%.
Did you get the IRB?
Yeah. Yeah. By entering this room, you've given us consent.
Only for photography.
Yeah, there you go. I'm totally too. Yeah.
I was not.
Yeah. Okay, you ready to talk to each other about ethics in this context? Okay, go ahead. Talk to each other about these ethical considerations.
You have spoken, I feel like, well, you've had the least chance to go in.
Two options if you are.
I guess let's answer these, unless you have.
Remember what I remember.
I guess I would just think generally, I personally think, I guess it's actually part of for this paper, actually, if you are.
Someone that they are from a group that tends to.
They don't feel like biased.
Right before you give an exam.
An anonymized data collection.
When they're not about to take an exam.
But there's a difference between someone being told that it's anonymized and feeling that it's like.
Okay, but what if they want to see this? Some, but not others.
I just got interviewed about AI usage recently by a researcher at Microsoft, and it's weird because she's like recording it, she's telling me all the time that it's like anonymized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you're like, oh, I'm recording this, it's gonna be in the text. It feels like if something goes wrong, you're not anonymous.
Very real.
Yeah.
100% real. I get that. I think with the
Right.
like, or it makes me feel like my race or my gender or my sexuality or my better age as their field, right? And then the anonymous
I just haven't read.
Yeah.
from that right now.
You have to depend on that being
Might be guidelines.
You are sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but I imagine, assuming all that is okay, still, how do you do it correctly is the question.
But it's also like,
How do you actually, well, I guess number two is it's kind of on the topic, of like, how do you make people not feel weird about?
That is true.
deal with that, like, wrong.
Yeah.
At the same time, if it's ethically better, great.
Okay, let's come back together as a whole group.
Say that, it's such a cool idea.
Should reveal it.
Okay, what were some things that you all were talking about? You don't necessarily have to answer one of these questions in particular, but if you do, yeah.
I was sharing about perhaps coming up with a more unbiased way of collecting identities or forms of pinpoint
Yeah.
instead of asking in a Google form whether you are first generation or not, because that will be very intimidating for first generation students if they choose like yes. We were thinking about just putting everything in and then have them tick the boxes of the identities they choose to belong to.
Sure.
So it kind of reduces that mental stress of every single choices you have to get, like, are you a veteran or not? Are you like first generation or not? But
Yeah.
that will be hard to process the data as if discussed. So
Yeah.
that's a possibility.
But it's a good, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, there's also some really nice, like survey design elements. Like if you put some of these identifiers at the end of the survey instead of the beginning of the survey, it's better for students or better for the survey respondents because it doesn't like bring up. There's some really nice work in the stereotype literature, stereotype threat literature, right? If we ask students about an identity, that is associated with a particular stereotype, and then we ask them questions about, not about the stereotype, but about something related to that, it will be, it's worse for students.
Pattern recognition turns on.
Exactly. Pattern recognition turns on. Yeah. And those kinds of elements are actually not something that your IRB is going to be able to advise you on. They're going to look at your survey and say, oh yeah, this is minimal risk, right? So there's additional layers to all of these data collection elements that are worth it. Yeah, Terry, thanks.
Do you know if any of this, the design of these surveys, have they looked at kind of like a survey that is like, oh, I'm interested in you as a student, and having like a balance of, you know, some of them are looking at but some of them are also kind of pointing out what some strengths might be.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's a huge body of literature about like the additional kinds of capitals that students bring, like the community cultural wealth is like Yoso's work about like additional forms of capital. And so thinking about the strengths that students bring as opposed to even like some of this work can imbue some deficit thinking about students and think about these identities as deficits. Yeah, totally. And so there could potentially be ways to ask questions about that for students too. I think the other thing too, so I'm part of an organization that collects a ton of data and people want to access those data often, and they say, just give it all to me. I'm like, well, but what's your hypothesis, right? I think that education researchers fall into the trap that's like, yeah, sure, I'll ask about this because I can. But we don't think actually about if we should, right? Is first generation status part of your hypothesis that you're trying to test? If it's not, don't collect those data. Yeah, that's what I think.
Control for it.
Unless you want to control for it. But even that, you have to have really good justification for why you want to use it. I think. Yeah, Oren and then Rachel.
This third one makes me think about double blinding in general, et cetera, et cetera. But mostly like have someone else anonymize the data rather than me anonymize the data, or use some other technique that doesn't allow me to see the data before it's anonymized.
Yeah, I totally love that idea. Yeah, it's interesting. This part of the evolution of the IRB at the University of Washington too. They used to be real twitchy about collecting any kind of identifiers. Now they insist we do, but keep the identifying variables separate from the data we're working with. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's another thing to consider also. Do you need to be collecting identifiable data, right? In this case, they did because they're trying to connect student course outcomes to course features and student features. But there might be some data sets, actually, I know of many data sets or many awesome hypotheses that you can test within a single data set that doesn't actually rely on identifiable data. Yeah, and I like the idea of asking somebody else to identify it. You should check that with your IRB though, for sure.
Yeah.
To make sure that it's okay then that that person
Right.
has
Like a
access.
researcher now too.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, Rachel.
Depending upon the institution you're at, the institution collects 1 and 2. And you can write it into your IRB that you're requesting access to it, and in your informed consent for the students filling out the rest of the survey, you're giving informed consent that if you complete the survey, I will also be collecting this data from the university. And so then I'm not actually collecting that data at all. But because the institution already collects it and makes it available if I have a specific hypothesis that requires it. Yeah.
This is some of the amazing nuance of IRB because even still, some institutions need consent both to release grades and to use the particular survey. So, so even though you're not collecting it, students may still need to provide consent.
So it would be in my informed consent form, it is, you know, you check this box if you consent to using survey data and your grades and identifying information. If they say no, then they're just not on the survey. Like they are consenting to it.
Yeah,
And
totally.
it's in my consent form to my IRB.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Talk to your IRB. Collaborate. Collaborate.
Although make sure you're also, your institution actually collects the data you want. Sometimes they don't collect it.
Right.
For instance, gender, sometimes.
They almost always only
It's at
collect.
UNC with Kelly, and there's a big move to actually collect this data at an institutional level, so it's very privileged. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so are there questions about this? Okay, let's move to the next step a little bit, right? So we have a concept of what our outcome variable is. We have a concept of what treatment variables and confounding variables and identity variables we might want to collect. We're going to collect these collect and handle and store these data ethically now that we're experts. And in next, right, again, so if we're thinking about whether or not our hypothesis is testable and our data are measurable, a test for this can be to draw hypothetical figures. So again, it's amazing how hard this is for people, actually, always. But it's such a good practice because if you cannot label your x-axis with something meaningful, your y-axis with something meaningful and measurable, and then draw what your pattern is going to look like, it's a strong indication that you're collecting the wrong data. So what I want you to do is work with each other. In your worksheet, or in the packet, there are 4 data hypothetical figure boxes. Here there's only 2, but again, so Eddie and Hogan are thinking about low structure and high structure. They're measuring total exam points as an outcome, and they've collected student identities for continuing generation students, that's a CGN, and first generation students, which is FGN. So what would the data look like if you cannot reject the null hypothesis? What might it look like if you can reject the null hypothesis and your hunch is true? Or if you can reject the null hypothesis, but you're radically wrong about your hunch. Maybe work on your own. This is another weakness of mine as an instructor. I almost always skip the think part of think, pair, share. I know it's tough, especially when we're limited on time, but I'm gonna force myself to do it. Take like 1 minute on your own. Draw some of these figures. It should be bar charts. Then it should probably be 4 bars on the chart, 2 for continuing gen, 2 for first gen. Oh, I see. Okay. But there should only be 2.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Oh, within this box, I do 2 bars per Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so there should be one bar for first generation students.
Yes, yeah, and you color code it with the, yeah.
Exactly. And they're comparing high school. Okay, go ahead and talk with each other. Feel free. Anytime you're ready, no pressure. Work together.
Just like experience. Already.
Right.
Yeah, so that's.
Yeah, it's like, there's a number you can.
There's no impact.
Generation. Yeah.
That's what.
What you just did there.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly.
Make sure you label your boxes too, right? This is the null type. This would be we cannot reject or
Those
no.
are some of the possibilities,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think.
Yeah, I can't. I'm still
Yeah,
the
high
last
structure
one.
is not disproportionate.
Yeah, they do.
It is.
When they were actually looking at it. Just structure increase.
Yeah.
They were looking for difference.
Yeah, I think I did this before.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which is like, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
I was,
Which you can see here too. If you
Yeah.
draw your figure, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
I went to the other
Yeah.
I went, well, it depends if they're looking at the difference in changes from pre to post for.
Well, they said
Do they have?
it'll disproportionately benefit first gen students. That's what it's saying.
No, it's an internet. Yeah.
What, these two, and then these two.
Yeah, so that would be.
Which one? But I guess an internet, that's where
That
I
is-
grew it actually.
Yeah.
We're looking
Yeah.
for something like
Yep.
this.
Yeah, so actually there could.
But like literally any other output. like-
Yeah, I was sitting there like interactive, like produce three like lines of code there,
Yeah.
tell me something.
There's a lot. Yeah.
There's a lot.
For sure. Yeah. I think.
Right. Anything, even if it's the reverse.
Structure doesn't make a difference for anybody.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, right, okay. Yeah, I mean, these are good
Okay,
possibilities.
let's come back together as a whole group. How did that feel? Was it good? Was it
Yeah.
hard? They have measurable data, right? They have a measurable outcome. They have the very clear treatment groups. They have nicely disaggregated data. Awesome. And even still, it was a little hard. Wait, what is it? What would it look like if the null hypothesis, the data support the null hypothesis? Yeah. Okay, super. So I have just provided a couple of examples here. So in these cases, I think I labeled them too, actually. Nope, I guess I didn't. Okay, so in this first, let me actually go back one step. So in this figure here, all students are doing better with the in a high structured class. And first generation students are doing disproportionately better than continuing generation students because, yes, because the increase in the total exam score for first generation students from low structure to high structure, that difference is larger than the difference between exam scores for continuing generation students from low structure to high
That's
structure.
sort of the hypothesis, actually.
Yeah.
No worries.
Okay, yeah, well, that is also a totally legitimate hypothesis
Yes.
that you would see the opposite effect
Yes.
actually. And which is why it's really helpful actually to draw out these hypothetical figures before you collect the data, right? So you have a sense of the many ways that you can be wrong. Similar, so here, these data, I think, would support at least one sort of null hypothesis, right? That actually high structure doesn't impact any student, right? In this particular case, first generation students have lower exam scores than continuing generation students. But again, it could be the opposite too. It's lots of.
But none of these let you reject them.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the hypothesis is, yes, correct. None of them let you reject the null hypothesis. Yeah. Well, I would actually say that with this one, you can probably, with this one, you can reject the null hypothesis. Because this is the alternative hypothesis.
Oh,
There-
yeah, I guess, yeah, it benefited, even though they're equal, it benefited the first generation students
disproportionate.
substantially more.
Exactly, yep, exactly. Yep. Okay, so at this moment, we have 20 minutes left together, 22 if we're being precise. We have two options. We can either move through the other parts of this framework, or because we're on a roll thinking about measurable data, we can go back to our own examples and try to work through what is our Y variable, is it meaningful, does it differentiate, what's our X variable to do. So if you want to work on your own data, your own project, thinking about whether it's measurable, raise your hand. Okay, awesome. If you want to keep working through Eddy and Hogan, but think about if it's a justifiable hypothesis, raise your hand. Okay, oh, interesting. That was like perfectly split. How about this? Let's start talking a lot faster. We'll breeze through the justifiable and avoiding pitfalls, and then we'll still have some time at the end to work on our own. Okay, here we go.
Sorry, Ellie, I
course.
hate to
No.
slow you down, but
No.
there's a lot of talk of hypotheses, and that's great. Like, I love hypotheses too. There's, hypothesis-driven research versus more exploratory stuff. Do you feel like for a new education researcher, it makes sense to think mostly in terms of hypotheses as opposed to just taking a bunch of data and sifting through it?
That's a really good question. Well, let's have strong opinions. Do you want to
My
take
strong opinion is if you are approaching this quantitatively, you should have a hypothesis, because otherwise you're just kind of.
Totally.
But qualitative is a whole other story. Because a lot of qualitative, this is not my expertise. So if I'm wrong, someone needs to tell me. But my take on qualitative is that, like, oftentimes there are a lot more exploratory questions that can be answered with qualitative data that don't have hypotheses attached to them. It's like, how does blah 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 work, right? And it's not like you're like, it's going to work in this exact manner, right? You're really like kind of using all of these student like descriptions to kind of pull that out.
Well, an interesting way this seems to contrast the open data thing, because I was talking to Ben, who's been collecting a lot of the big data, dandy data sets and such, is that he was saying, one of the benefits of open data stuff is that you can find your hypothesis by experimenting with the data, where here the data is kind of at a premium where you need to do a lot of work to collect even a little bit of data. And so you can't do that step of just like having fun and playing with things to generate a hypothesis. It feels like you really need to be driven by something to start.
It's tricky, and I think
Give and take.
yeah, exactly. And I think just like with like what is actually the difference between SOTL and deeper? There's a lot of gray area in between. And just like I fall pretty strongly on the like hypothesis driven, because it's really easy to fall into some of these pitfalls, like fishing, going on, like I can ask my students 50 different questions and then do 50 different analyses, and I will find something there. Whether or not it's meaningful is totally different. At the same time, it is totally true that sometimes we don't actually know. We think probably something like this is related to something like this, and so then we collect a bunch of things here, and so it's maybe not quite as like hypothesis driven as we're doing here. Although I think the other thing too, like as I've watched people try to start on education research, the biggest place they fail is actually here. They're like, I'll just like collect all these data because I can, right? Like that will end up in a place where your data just aren't publishable, or you get really like, our field is way more sophisticated now than it was even 10 years ago, even probably 5 years ago. And reviewers won't like it. It won't be publishable. It's like, yeah, I have these 50 things. I tested to see what's correlated with what this is. Look, like that won't be publishable anymore. And so even though this is a lot more labor intensive up front, because you need to think about your hypothesis and think about your data.
Not that that's bad. I never was saying any of that was
The
bad.
truth is in the middle. I totally 100%.
Yeah, it sort of just like prevents you from that step that you see in some places with large data sets, which is like exploratory data analysis, right?
Yeah, Michelle.
This is a very interesting discussion because when I look at deeper stuff,
Yes.
I think that it seems like it's like using social science research methodologies, but many of us don't have training in social science research methodologies. And I guess it feels a little bit like there's already decades of social science researchers who have had to fill out IRBs for so long that biologists we just didn't know. And there are ways to think about qualitative and quantitative data in those fields and how we can do research or generate hypotheses or contribute to theory in sort of because when we're doing research in our classrooms, it's not an experimental design, right? But you've proposed this like a 2x2 ANOVA study. So, but it's not technically that. So there are lots of factors that contribute to be a little bit more like borrowing from people who do field work or observation work or longitudinal study work. I think I'm always kind of confused about as deeper or research, education research develops its conventions for assessing knowledge. I'm not sure if there's borrowing from or sort of not deferring, but thinking about conventions that have already been part of for a very long time. For example, this could have worked simply because in high structure classes, the teacher had more chances to say, you did a great job. So you could have had a low structure class, but increase the amount of time that you said, great job. And that could have had the same effect. So it's but then we can't in this situation control for literally all of but I don't often read papers that address that in the way that social science researchers kind of always do.
So there's there's
What am I saying? I don't even know.
no.
You're hitting it right on the
Yeah, I was gonna say there's so much there for sure.
This is 2014.
Yeah, so first of all, this was 2014. Second of all, I have cherry picked very few things from this particular, this paper is actually really nice in all of the controls that they're thinking about. There's with all research and maybe especially education research, there's all kinds of caveats, right? This actually probably doesn't even explain half of the variation in exam score, right? And that's not even presented here, right? So there's a lot of that. I think also, and this is, I actually really appreciate you bringing this up, Michelle, because it's something that Melissa and I must have said 800 times while we're preparing this. And as we're thinking through this, all of those confounders and controls are fine if you're doing scholarly teaching, right? Because then you're oh yeah, I did this thing. It was cool. I think this thing happened or not, right? It's about how you reflect on it. And that is still way more scholarly than I showed up in class, breezed through my PowerPoint and I'm done, right? And so because this is all a continuum, I think you're I think in that case, I think staying in the scholarly teaching is really great and sufficient, right? In a lot of ways. Once you start disseminating stuff even to colleagues, oh, I did this thing, it's totally great, you should try it, then you need to make sure your methods are a little tighter, your conclusions are a little bit tempered, right? It felt great, you should try it because you should feel great too. That's fine, right? But but education research is decidedly going on to that, and absolutely borrowing from multiple fields as we assemble knowledge. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that we talked about too in this workshop, I've actually given a number of workshops about or workshop series about getting involved, getting started in education research. But I've literally never in my life heard of a workshop that's getting started in ecological research. What? Give me a right or come be a neuroscientist. Come on over, get started. That's in a 2-hour workshop. That just doesn't happen, right? Could you imagine? And so so you're totally right. this is like a huge field, incredibly interdisciplinary, right? And evolving extremely fast. Yeah. But
Seems very hard. Yeah, as for me, that's exactly sort of this level of statistical analysis. The challenge for me would be doing that while doing statistical analysis on like whatever subject I am doing this.
Yeah.
If I want to do it at the same level of fidelity, at the same level of honesty, it does require the same amount of thinking through. And so you kind of working two jobs at the same time when you go to the level of deeper, let's say.
or now there are programs for PhD people to get a PhD in this discipline, right? And you're not going to 2-hour workshop your way there, right?
There's definitely,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, I got
I definitely feel like I'm
Totally.
gonna run down or up in the ladder, whatever it means to get better at doing.
Totally. And we have these resources. Like we are deeper researchers. We have training in this. Yeah, Rachel.
Is there still space for Sodal? Like, because it feels like the field is shifting into deeper, and Sodal in some fields, it's not all, but in some fields it's incredibly difficult to publish now.
I think there's still totally, in my opinion, there's still totally space for Sodal. It's not going to be in the top journals, right? But I think that's fine. And like, I think that like our Center for Teaching and Learning at UW hosts a Symposium for Teaching and Learning, which is amazing for Sodal. We host a weekly seminar series too. I think some of that is awesome for Sodal and for getting some of the feedback. So I think that where it's published is changing a lot. And so I think that's the biggest thing.
I think there's opportunities to present too at different conferences. There are some much more practitioner-oriented conferences, like ABLE for biology laboratory educators, and then even disciplinary conferences like ESA, right? Like where maybe as Sodal, maybe your point is to reach other people who are teaching ecology. And so ESA then, for instance, is a great place to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think talks, like presentations and posters and even workshops, like here's this cool thing that I do in my class.
Do you want to plug something, Sam?
Well, I was just gonna say, one justification I hear for people sticking with Sodal is that it has more impact. So there's some literature that says education research does not impact practice very much because the people doing the
That's the same for educational development literature.
Yeah.
Is that it impacts
Whereas if
practice?
somebody says, here's a cool lab that I developed and it's usable,
I will say it does sometimes as a deeper feel like we're like speaking like this like language that does not translate down to instructors. But I think that as a deeper person, I will say that part of my job is to try to make sure I'm reaching.
I mean, that's always the thing when you're a theoretician, not as, I mean, you build theory, you're clearly going to be further from the ground.
Also just a normal 20-year gap between research and practice. It's 17 years for medical research to get it into like 14% of like clinicians practicing with it. It is normal.
The other thing I would say, so one of the roundtables at lunchtime was about additional funding sources now that national funding is on the rocks a little bit. So WT Grant, actually the William T. Grant Foundation actually has an entire funding mechanism to understand how we can get research to practitioners in education, whether it's K-12 or higher education. And so I think that I really do think that there's space for both Deaver and Sodal, like how it interacts in the research ecosystem or practitioner ecosystem or both, right? Because most of the people doing the work are both researchers and practitioners.
Well, I mean, to Michelle's point, the social scientists will give this field much more reputation if deeper is a more developed out thing, which then will feed back into.
Yeah, it's also something super interesting, right? Because I think part of the hope for discipline-based education researchers is that they are embedded in the disciplinary departments, right? As opposed to not in a disciplinary department, right? Like my social scientist colleagues can generate hypotheses about what's going to happen in introductory biology courses, but they can't test those hypotheses because they're not teaching those classes. I'm teaching those classes. And so we can work together to develop hypotheses and test them together. But I think, there is something about the discipline, the disciplinary positioning.
I was just asking because it's super noticeable the publications are changing.
Yeah.
Have been changing.
Yes.
Yeah.
We talked about
We were
that
even
too.
talking about how it's deeper is just.
It's really different.
As someone that is sitting on like a bunch of so publications, it's suddenly like, oh, these are going to go to different places than I thought they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, totally.
Yep.
Same. I just found it, anyways, yeah, same. Same. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's different now. Yeah.
All right, so we chose option C. Of the two adventures I chose. But this is great. This is great. There's more resources here to work through more of this Eddie and Hogan paper, to work through your own the framework in its entirety is presented here. But I really appreciate the discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.